I came through the side door at 11:30 at night, my coat still carrying the smell of the funeral home, and the very first thing I heard before I even had my boots off was my daughter-in-law's voice through the kitchen wall. Your father has no value anymore. His brother died and left nothing behind. Now he's just an old man living off us, becoming more confused and troublesome every day. That's what she said. She spoke my name like I was a problem she was exhausted from dealing with. I want you to sit with that for a second. 31 years I gave to the Dearborn assembly line. I buried my wife. I raised a son. I came into that house with one suitcase because Marcus told me I was family, told me I belonged there. And I'm standing in the mudroom in my wool socks, coat half off the peg, and I'm hearing the woman my son chose talk about me the way you talk about a leaking roof. I didn't burst through that door. I know you want me to say I did. I didn't. And what happened instead, what I did instead, changed the rest of my life in ways I'm still measuring. My name is Ronald Webb. People call me Ronnie. I'm 69 years old. I worked 34 years at a Ford stamping plant in Dearborn, Michigan, and I came home from my brother Lawrence's funeral in Flint with a secret sitting in my chest like a lit match, and I had no idea how fast everything was about to catch fire. Let me tell you who I am before I tell you what happened, because the story doesn't make sense unless you understand the kind of man I've been most of my life. I'm the kind of man who absorbs. My late wife Dottie used to say that about me, not as a compliment, mind you. She'd say, Ronnie, you take in every bit of pain and inconvenience that comes your way and you just hold it. You never put it down anywhere. You just hold it until you can't breathe. She said it gently, but she meant it as a warning. I didn't listen. I never really learned until it was almost too late. Dottie passed 8 years ago November. Breast cancer, found late, moved fast. We'd been married 41 years. We had one son, Marcus, who was 39 when his mother died and who cried at the graveside in a way that broke something open inside me. I'm not sure I ever fully closed back up. When the house in Melvindale got to be too much, too quiet, too full of her things, too much of her and not enough of her at the same time, Marcus was the one who said the words. He said, Dad, come stay with us. Clarice and I have got that finished basement. The girls would love having you around. You shouldn't be alone out there. And I believed him. Every single word of it. I believed him because I needed to, and because he was my son, and because I was 62 years old, and I had just lost the only person who ever really knew me. That was 7 years ago. The basement Marcus promised me became a storage room within the first year. I was moved up to what they called the sunroom, a converted back addition with single-pane windows, a portable space heater that tripped the breaker if the dishwasher ran at the same time, and a draft along the baseboard that made the whole room feel like the inside of a beer cooler by January. I slept in my coat some nights. I never said a word. Because I didn't want to be difficult. Because I didn't want Marcus to regret asking me. Because I was a man who absorbed. My granddaughters, Jade and Simone, were 12 and 10 when I moved in. Now they were 19 and 17. And they walked past me in the hallways of that house like I was a coat rack that occasionally said good morning. Clarice, my daughter-in-law, had become something colder and more efficient with every passing year. She ran a corporate litigation practice downtown, made more money than Marcus, made more money than I would see in 5 lifetimes at the plant, and she had the energy of someone who had organized every corner of her world with precision, including me. I was a line item to her, an obligation column, something to be managed toward an exit. 3 weeks before the funeral, Lawrence's lawyer called me. Lawrence, my younger brother by 4 years, my bunk bed partner in our parents' house on Tyreman Avenue, the one who had moved up to Flint in his 20s and started hauling freight in a secondhand international truck. I'd always assumed he was getting by. He'd lived simply, drove an old truck, ate breakfast at the same diner every morning. He never married, no kids. He'd called me once 3 years ago and I'd wired him $1,100 because I thought he was struggling after a slow winter. He'd thanked me, he'd taken the money. His lawyer, a woman named Miss Venable, sat me down in her office on Saginaw Street and slid a folder across the desk without much preamble. Lawrence had turned that one truck into a freight logistics company that ran routes from Flint and Lansing west through Chicago, south into Tennessee, and up into Ontario. 3 properties, a working cattle operation in the Upper Peninsula, a family farm in Montmorency County he'd bought from a retiring friend, and a house on Lake Huron log construction, private shoreline, 2 stories, sitting on a bluff above the water like something out of a dream I didn't know I was allowed to have. And then she paused, set her glasses down on the desk, and told me that after taxes and the sale of the company, my brother had left me $4.6 million in a brokerage account at Flagstar Bank. I asked her to say the number again. She did, twice, because she could see I'd gone somewhere else inside my own head. I sat in that chair in her Flint office, and I thought about the $1,100 I'd wired him. I thought about him thanking me, and I couldn't decide whether to laugh or put my head down on the desk and weep. I drove home from that funeral 12 hours south and west, back toward Detroit, back toward Dearborn, back toward that cold sunroom, with a plan forming in pieces through every mile of I-75. I would tell Marcus and Clarice I'd inherited a few pieces of property. Small farms, modest stuff, nothing life-changing. I'd let them believe what they assumed, which was that Lawrence had died with nothing much to speak of. And I would figure out what to do with the rest quietly, on my own terms, the way I should have been doing most things for the past 7 years. That was my plan when I pulled into the driveway on Fieldcrest Drive at 11:30 at night. Then I heard Clarice. I stood in that mudroom coat half off, right hand still on the peg, boots on the rubber mat, and I let her words come through the swinging door. She was saying my name in the tone she used for billing disputes. She said I'd been there 7 years. 7 years she had been patient. 7 years she had been, in her words, a saint about the whole situation. And Marcus, my son, my boy, who had once cried in my arms because his hamster died, said, in a voice so tired it barely registered, I know. I know. She kept going. She said Lawrence had nothing. She said whatever I'd been hinting about farms and property was clearly nothing. She said I was now, quote, even more useless than before. She said I was an old man eating their food and fogging up their windows and getting more confused every month. Marcus made a sound like he wanted to object. And Clarice said these words, I will carry to my grave. I am not going to become a full-time caregiver to your father in this house. We have a plan. We talked about this. Cedarwood Pines. Early memory wing. His pension and his Social Security cover most of the cost. We just need the power of attorney signed before it gets medically complicated, because once it becomes a court thing, it's messy. There was a silence. Then Marcus said, he doesn't have anything for the girls' tuition. I was kind of hoping, Lawrence. And Clarice cut him off. She said they were on Plan B. She said I needed to be out before their new construction in Bloomfield Hills closed in October. She said they needed it clean, with paperwork that held up. She said she wasn't spending the next decade wiping anyone's backside, that she'd made her position clear when I moved in, and that 7 years was already past the upper limit. I backed up. I put my coat back on the peg. I picked up my boots and I carried them through the side door, and I walked to the end of the driveway in my socks before I sat down on the curb in the November dark and put them on. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to tie the left one. Then I got in my truck and I drove. I drove to a Quality Inn off I-94, and I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like cleaning product, and I looked at the wall for 3 hours, not crying, not sleeping, just looking at the wall the way a man looks at something he can't quite believe is real. Honestly, if that had been you, if you had sat on that curb and heard those words replaying in your head, I don't know what you would have done. I've thought about it a lot. Most people would have gone back through that door. Most people would have confronted the situation immediately, which is exactly what I used to think I should do too. But there was a part of my brain, the part that spent 34 years on a plant floor watching where the equipment moved, knowing when to step forward and when to hold still, that part said, not yet, not yet. By morning, I had a different man's plan. I called Miss Venable first thing. I told her I needed to come to Flint and sit with her for several days. I told her I had heard something the night before that changed the picture entirely, and I needed to build something that could not be taken from me. She said, come whenever I needed. I called Marcus from the hotel parking lot and told him my old friend Terrence had taken a turn and I was heading north to see him. Might be a week. Marcus said, take care of yourself, Dad. In the voice you use on someone you're hoping will stay gone a little longer than usual. I could hear it now. I could hear everything now. I drove north. I stopped in Flint. I sat in Miss Venable's conference room from 8 in the morning until 6 at night for 9 straight days. We set up a Michigan LLC with me as sole member and transferred every asset Lawrence had left me into it. We opened accounts distributed across 3 banks, none of them in Wayne County. We filed the real property into the LLC. And then Miss Venable had her firm pull the title and mortgage history on the house at Fieldcrest Drive because I asked, because something in me needed to know the full landscape, and what she found made me go very still. Marcus and Clarice were underwater. They had refinanced twice in the past 4 years. They had taken a private second mortgage 18 months ago to fund a renovation that stalled halfway through. You could still see unpainted drywall in the upstairs hallway if you look closely. The lender on that second mortgage was a private equity note holder, and they were in default. 3 missed payments. According to Miss Venable's mortgage specialist, they were 60 to 90 days from a power of sale proceeding. I bought the note on a Tuesday afternoon. My LLC acquired the defaulted second mortgage for pennies relative to the outstanding balance. By Wednesday morning, I held the paper on my son's house. I drove home on a Friday. I stopped at a Coney Island off I-75, and I sat in a window booth with a black coffee, and I thought about whether I was being cruel. I thought about Dottie, what she would say, what she would think of the man I was becoming in that booth. I thought about Jade and Simone and whether they had any idea what their mother had been planning. I thought about Marcus at 9 years old, riding on my shoulders at the Michigan State Fair, reaching up to touch the lights. I thought about the difference between the person I'd raised and the person sitting in that kitchen saying, I know to everything his wife told him to accept. I needed to know if there was still any of my boy left. That was going to determine how this ended. When I pulled into the driveway, Clarice was at the kitchen window. She waved. I waved back. I went inside, hung my coat, hugged Marcus, told them Terrence had passed peacefully, and I'd helped his daughter sort through some things. Clarice said all the right words. Marcus asked if I was okay. I said I was tired and went to bed early, and I started to perform. Not wildly, carefully. I let Clarice see me put my keys in the fruit bowl, and then asked 15 minutes later if she'd seen my keys. I stood in the garage one afternoon looking lost when she came out to get something from her car. I put the orange juice back in the cabinet. Once, and this was deliberate, I called Marcus by his Uncle Lawrence's name at breakfast, then caught myself and said, sorry, I don't know where that came from. I watched Clarice's face every time. I watched the tight, controlled smile that appeared and disappeared in less than a second. I watched her reach for her phone the moment she thought I'd looked away. She was building a file. I watched her do it for 6 weeks. 6 weeks in that cold sunroom. 6 weeks of being talked past at dinner. 6 weeks of hearing her on the phone with her sister, calling me a drain, a shadow, an old fool who didn't know what decade it was. And every night after they went to bed, I went down to the laundry room where I'd taped a small recording device behind the dryer vent, and I wrote down everything I'd heard that day in a composition notebook. Miss Venable had given me dates, times, direct quotes. Every mention of Cedarwood Pines, every reference to Dr. Hamill, the family physician Clarice, had already started courting for a medical letter. On Tuesday and Thursday mornings, Marcus worked from home. Thursdays, Clarice had Pilates and a standing lunch with her sister. That gave Marcus and me 3 hours alone in the kitchen. The first few Thursdays, he was careful with me, polite but distant. The way you are with a relative you've been told is fragile. By the fourth Thursday, he started talking. Really talking. He told me his marriage had become something he didn't recognize. He said Clarice had changed after making partner, that money had become a different language for her, that the Bloomfield Hills build was her dream, and he'd been pulled along behind it like a cart. He said he'd lost 2 of his closest friends over the past 3 years because Clarice found reasons they weren't the right kind of people. He told me he didn't know how to push back anymore. He didn't know when he'd stop trying. One Thursday in early November, he looked at me across the kitchen island and he said, Dad, I'm sorry the sunroom is so cold. I keep meaning to fix that insulation and I never do. I'm sorry. And I put my hand on his arm and I said, Marcus, when you have something hard to say to me, you say it. I'm not going anywhere. He looked at me for a long moment with his mother's eyes, and they got wet, and he nodded. Then Clarice's car came up the driveway 40 minutes early, and the moment closed up like a hand making a fist. The default notice came through in mid-December. Miss Venable's specialist confirmed the clock had started on the power of sale process. My LLC would have clean title to the house at Fieldcrest Drive by late January. Clarice moved on her own timeline 2 days before Christmas. She'd made a roast. She'd opened a good bottle of wine. After the plates were cleared, she laid a manila folder on the table in front of me, with the manner of a woman presenting a contract she'd already decided would be signed. She said Marcus, and she had been thinking about the future, about making sure I was protected as I got older. She said it was just some paperwork, nothing complicated. She slid the folder across and handed me a pen. I looked at the pen. I looked at the two documents inside, power of attorney for property and power of attorney for personal care, both naming Clarice as primary attorney with Marcus as backup, drafted by her firm's estate department and already witnessed. I looked at Marcus, who was looking at his plate. I looked at my granddaughters at the far end of the table, both on their phones. I looked at Clarice. She was watching me with that smile. Patient, certain. I said, Clarice, this is thoughtful. I'd like to read it over and take it to my own lawyer, just to make sure I understand everything fully. She said, of course, but let's not drag it out. Why don't I just sign the property one tonight? I said I'd rather sleep on it. She said my name in a tone that suggested I was being gently difficult. I said, thank you, dear. I appreciate you looking out for me. And I picked up the folder and took it to the sunroom. I did not sign anything. That night, I called Miss Venable. I said it's time. We set the date for January 9th. Christmas came and went. I gave the girls each an envelope with cash money I could afford, without thinking now, and they thanked me without looking up from their screens. Marcus drank too much wine and fell asleep on the couch by 9. I sat in my coat in the sunroom and called Terrence, my actual friend Terrence, who I have coffee with on Wednesday mornings at the Coney Island on Michigan Avenue, and I told him everything for the first time. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, Ronnie, you come stay with me. I've got a room. You don't deserve any of this. I told him I had a plan, and I'd explain after the new year. January 9th was a Thursday. Miss Venable flew in from Flint. Her associate, a methodical man named Mr. Dabrowski, came with her. We met at a law office in Midtown and drove out to Dearborn together in Miss Venable's rental. Marcus's truck was in the driveway. Clarice's Audi was next to it. Jade was at her boyfriend's. Simone was at school. I let them in through the front door. Clarice came out of her office with a coffee mug in her hand and went absolutely still when she saw two people in business clothes standing in her foyer. Marcus came down the stairs a moment later and looked from the strangers to me with a question forming on his face that I could see he was afraid to ask. I said, please come into the kitchen. We have something important to discuss. We sat down, the four of us, at the same island where Marcus and I had talked on those Thursday mornings. Miss Venable set a folder on the counter without theater. Clarice opened it. The first document was the deed transfer. The second mortgage on the house at Fieldcrest Drive had been in default for 93 days. Power of sale proceedings had been initiated in December. The note holder, my LLC, had completed the process. The property was no longer theirs. Marcus looked like he'd been struck. Clarice's hands, for the first time in 7 years, were not steady. Miss Venable said, in the tone of someone who has delivered difficult documents many times and feels no need to embellish, the LLC is solely owned by Mr. Ronald Webb. He has held title to this property for 6 days. Clarice said, this is a mistake. Miss Venable said it was not a mistake and opened the second folder. The missed payments, the original lender, the note transfer, every document with a date and a signature. Clarice started flipping faster and faster through the pages. Then she stopped. She looked up at me. She said, Ronnie, you did this. I said, yes, Clarice, I did. She said, why? I want you to understand what it felt like to be sitting at that kitchen island. 7 years I'd eaten leftover food from that refrigerator. 7 years I had been talked past at that table. 7 years I had slept 20 feet away, in a room so cold I could see my breath in February, and told myself it was gratitude. I had this woman's face memorized in 40 different expressions of mild tolerance, and she was asking me why. I said, because 9 weeks ago, I came home from my brother's funeral, and I stood in the mudroom, and I heard you tell my son that I was a parasite. I heard you say you were going to have me declared incompetent, strip my legal autonomy with a power of attorney you had drafted without my knowledge, and have me move to Cedarwood Pines before the end of January, so you could turn my room into an office and list this house in the spring. I heard all of it, Clarice. Marcus stood up so fast his stool hit the floor behind him. He said, Clarice, what is he talking about? She didn't answer. She was looking at me. I said, I have 6 weeks of recordings. I have a notebook with dates and direct quotes. I have the brochures you left on the counter. I have the appointment you made for me with Dr. Hamill that I didn't request. I have the power of attorney documents you tried to have me sign on December 23rd. Miss Venable has copies of everything. If I choose to file a complaint, what you have done constitutes a coordinated attempt at elder financial abuse under Michigan state law, and the recordings alone would be sufficient to open a criminal inquiry and end your partnership. Clarice started to cry. Not real crying, the controlled, tactical version. Marcus said, "Clarice, what did you do?" It was not a question. It was a man hearing something about the person he had trusted with everything and realizing in one long, awful second that he had known some of it all along. I said, "Marcus, sit down. I want to talk to you." He sat. His eyes were red. His were real. I said, "You have 60 days to vacate this property. I am not going to take it from you in a way designed to hurt you. You'll receive a fair settlement, not what Clarice had planned with the Bloomfield Hills house, but enough to get yourselves established separately. The girls can finish the school year here. After that, you're both going to make some decisions about what you want your lives to look like." Clarice said, "Ronnie, please, we can talk about this. This is family." I said, "Clarice, I am not finished." And then I told them, Lawrence did not die with nothing. Lawrence left me the farms and a house on Lake Huron and $4.6 million that had been sitting in a brokerage account since October. I had come home from that funeral planning to give Marcus a substantial portion of it. I had made that decision on the drive home, had spent 12 hours deciding it, had thought of it as my purpose, my contribution, what fathers do for their sons. And then I had stood in the mudroom and heard what I heard, and now the bulk of that money was going to a foundation I was establishing the following month. We were going to call it the Dorothy Webb Foundation, after my wife, after Marcus's mother. It would help elderly adults in Michigan who were being financially exploited by their own families find safe housing and independent legal support. I paused. I looked at Clarice directly. I said, "My wife told me before she died that she sensed a coldness in you she couldn't identify. I told her she was wrong. I told her you were just ambitious and had to be tough in a hard profession. She gave me a look that meant she'd already finished the argument I hadn't started. I should have listened to her. I should have listened to her a long time ago." Clarice said she'd see me in court. "Miss Venable said she was welcome to try, but she might want to think carefully about what 6 weeks of recordings introduced into a proceeding would do to her standing at the firm." I left the room. I went to the sunroom and I packed the same suitcase I'd arrived with 7 years before. One bag. A small box of Dottie's letters I'd kept under the bed. That was everything I owned in that house. Mr. Dabrowski helped me carry them to the car. Marcus came out as I was loading the trunk. He was in his socks, no coat, standing in the January cold of the driveway. He said, "Dad, I didn't know it had gone that far. I need you to believe I didn't know." I looked at him, my son, 46 years old, tall like his mother, tired in his eyes in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. I said, "Marcus, I think you knew some of it. I think you chose not to know the rest. That's a different thing, but it's not as different as you need it to be right now." He started to cry harder. He said, "What can I do?" I said, "You can figure out who you are without someone else telling you. And when you know, you call me. I'll be at Terrence's in Inkster through the winter. After that, I'll be at the house on Lake Huron. There's a landline there. Call me when you have something to say that belongs to you." He nodded. He couldn't speak. I got in the truck. Miss Venable and Mr. Dabrowski followed me in the rental. We drove to Terrence's house in Inkster, and Terrence had the spare room made up and a pot of chili on the stove, and I sat down at his kitchen table and I put my face in my hands for about 30 seconds, and then I picked my head back up. That was 5 months ago. I am writing this from the kitchen of the log house on Lake Huron. The ice came off the bluff 2 weeks ago. I had a contractor come up in March, and he insulated the entire structure properly and installed a new propane furnace, and I have been warm genuinely, unremarkably warm every single morning since. It is not a small thing. After 7 winters in that sunroom, warm is not a small thing. Marcus called me in early April. He'd moved to a 1-bedroom apartment in Ferndale. He'd filed. He wanted to know if he could drive up. I said yes. He came up on a Saturday and we sat on the porch above the water and we didn't say much for the first hour. Then he started talking. I let him go for a long time. He told me things about his marriage I didn't need to know, but I let him say them anyway because he needed to put them somewhere. The girls are with Clarice. He sees them on weekends. Jade reached out to me 2 weeks ago and apologized, a real apology, not a polite one, with specifics. Simone isn't ready yet. That's all right. I have time. I'm not going anywhere. The Dorothy Webb Foundation was incorporated in February. We've already helped 11 families in Michigan, 11 seniors in situations like mine, or worse than mine, sitting in cold rooms or being moved into facilities by relatives who had calculated the cost of their existence. Miss Venable sits on the board. Terrence, who it turns out has a remarkable head for nonprofit governance, sits on the board. Marcus started doing intake work 2 months ago. He's good at it. He sits with people and he listens and he doesn't try to fix anything too fast. He's becoming his mother's son again, slowly. But I can see it. I want to say something to you before I wrap this up. I need you to hear it clearly. I spent most of my life being a man who absorbed. I let things happen to me, small cruelties, small diminishments, and I called it patience. I told myself I was being the bigger person. The truth is, I was teaching everyone around me exactly how little I was willing to defend myself, and they were learning the lesson perfectly. Clarice didn't become cold overnight. She got there one small permission at a time, most of them mine. Every Christmas, I let her talk over me. Every winter, I kept a space heater that tripped the breaker and said nothing. I was showing her, and I was showing my son, and I was showing myself exactly how little I believed I was worth. That is on me. That is something I have had to sit with. And sitting with it doesn't mean I forgive the plan she had. It means I understand how it grew in the space I left it. Here is what I know now. Love is not the same as access. Family is not the same as permission. The people who share your blood do not automatically earn the right to make decisions about your life, your health, your legal standing, or the temperature of the room you sleep in. You are allowed to see what you are seeing, even when it is painful. You are allowed to act on it. Forgiveness is a gift you can offer once the truth is on the table, but not as a substitute for the truth, and not before. My son got my forgiveness because he was willing to look at himself. That is the only currency I deal in now. If you are listening to this and some part of it sounds like your own house, your own kitchen table, your own cold room, I want you to hear me. It is not too late. Write down what you see. Find someone who can help you understand your options. Do not wait for the paperwork to arrive. And remember that clarity is not cruelty, no matter what anyone in that house tries to tell you. I'm going to go pour a coffee now and go sit on the porch and watch the lake come back to itself after the winter. Lawrence used to say there was no sound in the world like the first wave of spring against a bluff you thought was frozen for good. I didn't know what he meant until I sat here alone and heard it. I understand now. I understand a lot of things now. If this story hits something in you, if you have ever sat in a room where someone looked right through you and called it love, I want to know. Drop a 1 in the comments if you think I handled this the right way. Drop a 2 if you think I should have confronted Marcus sooner. Drop a 3 if you've been in a situation like this and you're still in it, because I want you to know you are not invisible, you are not alone, and there are people who will help you find your way out of whatever cold room they've put you in. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because sometimes I think about all the people sitting up late with something they needed to hear, and I'm glad if this was it. If you've made it to the end of this, you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Hit subscribe. I'll keep bringing you stories that are worth staying for. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Detroit, Michigan, to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.